This will be a very special episode as we've crossed multiple milestones. This is episode 300, over a period of 6 years and over 500,000 downloads. This is quite an accomplishment, as the audience for this podcast is those of you who are 55 years of age or older, which is actually one of the smallest demographics that listen to podcasts. I want to give you a little history to the podcast and then play 4 segments from the episodes from the first 3 years of the podcast that I thought were particularly impactful. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 300 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. This will be a very special episode as we've crossed multiple milestones. This is episode 300 over a period of 6 years and over 500,000 downloads. This is quite an accomplishment, as the audience for this podcast is those of you who are 55 years of age or older, which is one of the smallest demographics that listens to podcasts. I want to give you a little history to the podcast and then play 4 segments, 4 very different segments from episodes from the first 3 years of the podcast that I thought were particularly impactful. I published episode number 1 of the podcast in late October of 2016. I started the podcast to help the launch of the second edition of Repurpose Your Career, a practical guide to the second half of life. The book published in April of 2017, and I originally planned to continue the podcast for maybe another year. The show's download numbers grew slowly. In April of 2018, the podcast was mentioned in AARP magazine as one of 3 podcasts for AARP magazine readers, which had a distribution of 29 million. Downloads the next month went from 2,000 downloads in April to over 10,000 in May. My wife and I then spent the summer of 2018 in Ajijic, Mexico. We closed up our condo in Austin and had our neighbors collect our mail each week and just put it in our condo. We returned to Austin in October. When I investigated the box of mail, I saw 5 or 6 packages that contained books. I was having major publishers send me books unsolicited. They wanted me to either review the books or have their authors on the podcast. My response was, what? Since that time, I am solicited just about every day by authors or their publicists to be on the podcast. I have discovered that this podcast was the greatest networking tool I have ever had. I have met and built relationships with so many interesting people, and to put it bluntly, it has enriched my life, and I've continued the podcast for that reason. My business, Career Pivot, which includes this podcast, no longer must be profitable. Over the last few years, the business and the podcast have done a little bit better than break even. I really enjoy creating this podcast. I started in 2018 blogging and creating some podcast episodes about our journey in becoming expats in Mexico. I largely did this to help me process what I was experiencing. And little did I know that those blog posts and podcast episodes would be quite popular. I have increased the frequency of those episodes based on feedback from listeners. Before we go any further, let me mention I have a sponsor for this episode, Magic Mind. Magic Mind is the world's first productivity drink. It is not an energy or coffee-based drink, but a drink that will help you stay focused. I've been using it for about a year and has made a real difference. but more on this later in the show. I want to take you back to some segments from 2017 to 2019 that I thought were particularly impactful. They are Gary O'Neill on looking for a job in the second half of life, Jonathan Rauch, author of The Happiness Curve, Why Life Gets Better After 50, Elizabeth White on being 55, underemployed, and faking normal, and lastly, Paul Tasner, becoming an entrepreneur at the age of 66. All four are very impactful for different reasons. So let's get on to the episode. Gary O'Neill is a good friend from Austin, Texas, where he has been a recruiting expert for many years. Gary would present to our job club periodically, and what I liked about Gary's style is he's very direct. He tells you how it is. Gary had come to the job club to speak on how he would perform a job search since he knew that the hiring processes at many companies were broken. He knew this because he consulted with a lot of the companies to fix their hiring process. Let's listen to what Gary had to say in episode 58, which was published in December of 2017. I wanted Gary on this podcast because he came into Launchpad, my job club, several weeks ago and talked about how he would approach a job search. So, Gary, where would you get started if you were looking for a job, knowing what you know?
Wow. Okay. Great question. And let's start with, if you don't mind, I'll take a step back and tell you a little bit about why I would do what I'm going to suggest that everybody do. Is that all right?
You betcha.
Cool. So what I've found is that I've been inside of at least 200 companies in a really meaningful way. And what I mean by that is really seeing the inside of how they recruit and how they hire, how the HR department works, how the recruiters work, how the hiring managers work, how they get approval for jobs to be open, all of that, right? And I've seen that in a very deep way as a consultant in at least 200 companies. I wouldn't be surprised if it was closer to 500, quite frankly. And what I can tell you is out of that experience, rarely does a company hire very well. So what I found out along the way is that the traditional approach that people use to find jobs and the traditional approach that lots of companies use to hire is really kind of broken. And let me be a little bit clear about that and what that means. What it means is that, most people go about a job search, or let's just say it's common that people go about a job search by finding open jobs and applying online. Well, here's what I can tell you about that, is that in most of the companies that I work with, most of the resumes never get looked at. No one has the time to do it. No one has the interest to do it. Some of them are coming in through email. Some of them are coming in through an applicant tracking system. The applicant tracking system are slicing, dicing, and sorting by keywords. Then you have junior people who are doing the initial screening who wouldn't really understand how to evaluate my background with respect to the role that I'm looking at. It's no fault of their own. They just don't have the world experience to be able to do that. And when they are going through these piles of resumes, they're only picking a handful. And odds of me even moving forward after my resume gets looked at are really pretty low. At the end of the day, what I know is that no one gets hired unless they talk to the hiring manager. And that applicant tracking system and the email that my resume is lost in, and the junior administrator who's looking at my stuff, and the recruiter they're all in my way. None of them are there to help me get to the hiring manager. Most of that stuff is preventing me from getting to the hiring manager. Let me be clear. There are some companies who do a great job in recruiting and hiring, but the majority don't. And so since I know that the systems are broken, because I've seen them broken, it's been my job to try to fix a bunch of them, which is really, really difficult to do. I think I just wouldn't play the traditional game at all. And I'd probably take a pretty different approach. So that's the reason why I would do that. So if you'd like, I'm happy to jump into kind of approach I would take.
So yeah, what is the approach you would take? Because by the way, I recently this last year had a client who had applied for a job at a major pharmaceutical company. She's a director level, and she didn't hear anything back. And she was getting all pissed off. She was getting all pissed off. And I said, do what you have control. You know somebody who knows the hiring manager.
Yeah, right.
Right? So I said, go call her. And sure enough, she called. She went into the hiring manager's offices. How come you haven't, called Allison?
Right.
And he said, I have never seen a resume.
Yeah, there you go. And isn't it crazy, Mark? I mean, somehow or another, with regard to hiring, people think that there's all these rules, right? They think that there's all these steps. And well, what if I break the rules? And what if I don't follow the rules, right? It's just like, who made those rules? Those rules are not there to serve you. They're kind of make believe. The rules work differently inside of every company. And I'm not sure why we forget along the way that at the end of the day, it's people who hire people, and your ability to contact and interact with the hiring manager is the only thing that matters. Like everything else doesn't matter. All of them. And so kind of to your point, why is it that somebody didn't kind of go, oh, well, all I got to do is get my person to introduce me to that person and off we go, right? But instead we want to wait in line and we want to follow the rules. So, if you're one of the people who tends to follow rules, I'm going to encourage you that when you're in job search mode, particularly if you're trying to do a career pivot of some sort, you really got to not break the rules, just pretend like they don't exist. I mean, make up your own.
Jonathan Rauch is an award-winning writer and author of The Happiness Curve, Why Life Gets Better After 50. I found this book to be absolutely fascinating and my discussion with Jonathan to be equally enjoyable. I republished this episode in 2020 and has garnered over 5,000 downloads from those two instances. Let's listen to Jonathan Rauch discuss the happiness curve in episode 78, which published in May of 2018. What the heck is the happiness curve, or U-shaped curve of happiness, and how do you measure happiness?
Both are wonderful questions. I'll take the second one first. So what we're talking about here is life satisfaction. It's not the mood you're in. You gauge people's mood with questions like, how often did you smile yesterday? We're talking about evaluative satisfaction with your life. And that's a question like, compared to the best possible life you could imagine, how's the life you're living right now? Or how satisfied are you with your life? You're asking people to tell you generally how content they are with what's going on in their lives. Those questions have been asked since the 50s in a few basic formats to millions and millions of people in virtually every country in the world. And what we found out is people are really quite good and reliable at gauging their happiness. You get very good, consistent results. So we have actually amazingly good data on life satisfaction. So the second question, what is the U-shaped happiness curve? Well, with all this data, some economists in the 90s started noticing this pattern kept appearing. It just fell out of the data. Suppose you get all this data on happiness, and then you take away everything you can think of that might affect people's happiness, like their income, education, whether they're married, whether they have kids, whether they've been unemployed, their physical health, their mental health. You take it all out. Well, then you should see a flat line, right? Because there's nothing going on. But they didn't. What they found is that even after everything else is accounted for, time has its own effect on happiness, and it's U-shaped. Life satisfaction tends to decline from their early 20s. It bottoms out at midlife, and then it starts rising again right through death. Now, that's not saying that's what's going to happen to Mark Miller, because there are lots of other things going on in your life. If you get unemployed or divorced, that's going to be bad for you. But it does mean time, aging all by itself, has an effect on happiness, and it's not what we think. We think of aging just makes us sad, right? Because we get older and we get frail, and that's terrible. Not true at all. Midlife is the time when aging really works against happiness, and then when we least expect it to, it switches sides.
Yeah, it's interesting. I took some time off in the last part of the decade to teach high school math in an inner city high school. And one day, some of my freshmen asked me, they were asking me how old I was. I told them I was 50 something. And I asked them, how old are you? 16. And they said, and I said, I looked at them and says, I'm so much happier being 50 than being 16. And they were amazed at that. Now there's some really
Were you
funny
happier
stories.
being, so now you're what, in your 60s? Are you happier being in your 60s than you were 20 years ago?
Oh, yes, very much so. That's why your book appealed to me, because I am definitely experiencing this U shape as a lot of obligations go away. I'm not saving for retirement anymore. The son turned into a decent human being, got off my payroll.
That's nice.
Right? So, the amount of obligations that society places on me is a lot less.
Well, but you're changing too, because it turns out what's going on here isn't just about your circumstances. Your brain is changing. That's been well documented. As we age into the later decades of life, we become more positive in outlook. The stereotype of the bitter old curmudgeon is just wrong. We have less regret. We experience less stress. Again, that's after adjusting for the things in your life. Stress drops steadily after 50. We get better at controlling our emotions and less volatile. In all these respects, our minds change in ways that actually make it easier to be satisfied with our lot in life. So your brain is changing, your priorities are changing, and that's part of what you just described. As we age in through the happiness curve, we shift from being oriented toward seeking satisfaction, through ambition and checking off all the unchecked boxes in your life that you have to accomplish. That pressure starts to go away. Our priorities start shifting toward friends and family and investing in the really important relationships. And that's much better for our happiness. So when I hear Mark Miller say, well, the sources of this stress have gone away, that may be true. But a lot of what's happening is Mark Miller is also changing in ways that reduces how much the sources stress him.
Magic Mind, which I said in the introduction, is the world's first productivity drink. I only accept sponsors for this podcast where I've used their products. I'm enthusiastic about the products. Well, I've been using Magic Mind for about a year. I drink Magic Mind with my morning coffee and I actually like the taste and sip on the product while drinking my morning coffee. I first used the product on our 3-day drive from our home outside of Guadalajara, Mexico to Austin, Texas. This is a 1,000-mile drive that we've made over a dozen times. I found myself more alert and focused. Currently using as we start our annual content audit and planning for the next year for Career Pivot. I will tell you there is close to 1,000 pieces of blog posts and podcasts, and I found Magic Mind invaluable helping me stay focused. I'm spending a lot of time strategizing how to grow this podcast, and Magic Mind has helped me with my own creative thinking. Magic Mind is a productivity drink. It's not an energy or coffee-based drink, but a drink that will help you stay focused on what you are doing and beat procrastination and get you into a working flow state. As I said, I drink this with my morning coffee, and after 30 minutes, I'm ready to go to work. If I continue to use it on a daily basis after 5 or 10 days, you will notice that you'll be more productive, stop procrastination, and will get into a working flow state much easier. There are lots of ways to consume the product, including making a latte, chugging, or sipping. Magic Mind works for me, and I believe it'll work for you. I have a 20% off code to share with you guys. It's RYC, which stands for Repurpose Your Career. To use it, you can go to magicmind.co. That's magicmind.co/RYC. Enter the RYC at checkout. The best part is that they have a money-back guarantee. If you get the subscription, it's 40% off. My 40% off code only lasts 10 days, so hurry up. And as always, the link and discount code will be included in the show notes. Let's move on to the episode I recorded with Elizabeth White, who wrote the book 55 Underemployed and Faking Normal, Your Guide to a Better Life. Elizabeth is an incredibly credentialed individual who was spit out of the professional world in the Great Recession. Let's listen to Elizabeth tell her story in episode 109, which was published in January of 2019. Today, I have Elizabeth White, who is the author of 55 Underemployed and Faking Normal, Your Guide to a Better Life. And Elizabeth, I read your bio before we got on the call, but you have a compelling story, and I'd like you to tell it.
First, thank you so much for having me. And we got to chat a little bit before, and I was rhyming and resonating to that conversation. So I look forward to getting more into the things we were talking about. So let me start with how I landed here. So first, no one aspires to be the poster child for broke and near broke boomers. I tell your audience that is not on your bucket list. And I landed here, as many people do. There's an event. So it could be job loss, some kind of medical diagnosis, divorce, something where in your life you start describing it as before X happened and after X happened. So for me, during the Great Recession, I had two really good consultancies, long-term, and I lost them both within 6 months. And I was in my mid-50s then. I have great background. I had zigged and zagged, most of my career working at the World Bank. I have a Harvard MBA, a master's in international studies from Johns Hopkins. I had my own business for a number of years. I had never had trouble finding employment. And suddenly, in my mid-50s, my phone just was not ringing. And, it's a shock when you have a background where my network, I would hear about jobs before they were posted. And suddenly, all of us have friends who are sort of 10 years older and 10 years younger. So when you're mid-50s, a certain part of your network is now retiring, or they're out of the game. Some have died. So I didn't have the network that I used to have. And I wrote an essay at some point where, I described what it felt like to land here when you've had career choice, decent or significant income, and you're suddenly looking at downward mobility because weeks turned into months and months turned into years, where I was getting little short assignments, but nothing near, in terms of earnings, what I was accustomed to. And the other thing I started to notice, friends who were going through the same kind of experience. And women talk, and we speak candidly about what's happening to us. So this essay I wrote talked about what it's like when you are now part of the formerly and used to be. And I sent it around, and it made its way eventually onto the PBS Facebook page. And within 3 days, it had 11,000 likes and 1,000 comments. And the comments were from people saying, this is my story, my husband's story, my daughter's story. How come we're not having this conversation? And I read every comment, and I was astonished that what I thought was sort of my story and maybe a small group of my friends was actually this much bigger story. So I have the background to look at the data. And when I looked at the data, I was shocked at the magnitude of this retirement income crisis and that we're not talking about it. And what happens when people make a comment to a blog post, a couple of sentences, they can now find you online. And so when they would send me emails, I'd get a page and a half single space of story after story of people who felt like they had done everything right and got jettisoned from the workforce for some reason or another, downsized, outsized, something happened, were older workers and now could not get back in. And some people were here in the Washington area where I lived or were passing through. I met them. So some of the people I corresponded with became friends of mine. I started to look more and more into what was happening to people. And I couldn't find the book that I wanted to read. I wasn't looking for some kind of really dense, kind of wonky Brookings Institute tome on what was happening. I wanted to read something that told this story from somebody who was having this lived experience. So the model I had as I was writing this book is I'm standing at my back fence talking to my neighbor. And we're talking about what does it mean to land here. And one of the things that I quickly understood that the cavalry is not coming. There's no big rescue happening to address all of these millions of people who've landed here. And just to give you a quick number, the median savings for near retirees, 55 to 64, is $15,000. That's the median. Even if you look at the middle 40% of earners in that category, it's only $60,000. Now, when you then look at what people talk about is the longevity bonus. So if we're in good health and we're in our early 60s, we've got easily another 20 years. And you're talking about 15,000 median retirement savings, or 60,000 even if you're in the middle income range. You see that those numbers don't work. You can't make that amount of money stretch to cover that period of time. So we're looking at a favorite economist of mine and retirement expert is Teresa Ghilarducci. She gives a number of 40% of near retirees, middle-class Americans, are looking at poverty and near poverty conditions in old age. And this is what we're just not talking about. So we're not talking about people who were irresponsible bad apples who've landed here. And we're not talking about people who are the marginalized poor who've always struggled their entire lives and then are having a really rough time of it in old age. We're talking about people who were okay and are now looking at downward mobility. And kind of the final point I would make on this is not a pesky little boomer problem. Boomers also don't have pension. Boomers are also in a don't want you job market. They're also looking at escalating costs in housing and healthcare. And they're also then facing $1.5 trillion of education debt. So when you look at that, you wonder why the conversation, when we think about retirement, are these sort of, what I call happy, positive aging, happy talk. The lawyer turned pastry chef, all these, sort of very cool reinvention stories, when the truth is there are millions of people who are really trying to figure out how they're going to, make these ends connect to support themselves over the next 20 years.
Let's finish up with one of my favorite people I've met with this podcast, Paul Tasner. Paul was laid off at the age of 64, which eventually kicked him in the butt to start his own bit company, Pulpworks. Paul can be a true inspiration to all of us. Let's listen to Paul tell his story in episode 125, which was published April of 2019. You're getting laid off. I remember you telling the story about, that day and your wife and what all happened.
As is the custom, and I guess, that's HR wisdom at play. I think the conventional wisdom is that you let people go on Friday afternoons so that things have a chance to cool down over the weekend. So I was leaving the building Friday afternoon, going off to meet my wife and another couple for dinner, and I was asked to pop into a meeting, which I found a little unusual, but of course, and found out the meeting was for me. It was my exit interview. After my initial shock, and I guess that was a bit naive. I shouldn't have been shocked at all, but nevertheless, I settled into the meeting quite comfortably, to be honest with you. Apparently, I had an apple in my hand, and I continued to munch on the apple during the course of the meeting. So I guess I was fairly comfortable with the situation. That was pointed out to me in retrospect. I was let go, and along with two other folks at that time, went off to meet my wife, and they wondered what had kept me, and I said, "Well, I was just fired." And everyone thought that was incredibly funny, and we all had a good laugh until I insisted that I was not joking, which took a while to convince them, but I guess they could see that I was fairly comfortable with the situation, and we had a good dinner. Of course, my wife and I went on to drink far more than we should have during the course of the dinner, and we continued our conversation later that evening and the next day, and all was well. Really, I guess on some level it wasn't a surprise to me, and on some level it was definitely what's the expression? No, I was going to say, sort of a silver lining, but it was overdue and just the push that I needed, and that I'd never looked back. So it's funny. The events that bring us to where we are interesting to observe, looking back on them.
Yeah, sometimes I find, because I've done a bunch of these interviews, is often we need a kick in the ass to get us to actually go do what we really need to go do. And, unfortunately, many of our generation, that's what we need.
Exactly.
And so
exactly.
I'm presuming the layoff was a blessing in disguise.
It was. That's the phrase I was looking for, the blessing in disguise. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, as you said, I guess I had flirted with entrepreneurism, as I said earlier, all of my life, but I just didn't have the guts to take the plunge. I always found an excuse. Kids, mortgage, college tuitions, salary increase, all of those things that make you say, "Geez, I shouldn't do this." I'm quote risking too much. So it was a blessing in disguise, absolutely, and the kick in the butt that I needed.
What happened next?
And because I had done it earlier in my career, there was a period back in the 90s between jobs that I had decided to try my hand at consulting, and I did it for several years. And I mean, it was economically a successful time for me, but I didn't fall in love with it. I really struggled with sort of reinventing yourself for every new client over and over and over again. I found that a tough thing to do. But I certainly had a wonderful network and many opportunities to find projects. And so I did it for several years and ended up taking a full-time position with my last client, as it turned out. I'd done work for almost a year for this client, and at the end of the project, when I turned in a sort of a final report, the CEO asked me if I wanted to join the team and implement my own findings. And by then I had grown to really enjoy the business and the team, and I really didn't hesitate to say yes. But that's what I did when I was fired from my last position. I went back to consulting only because I couldn't think of anything else that I wanted to do, and I did need to generate some income, and so I did it for a couple of years. As I said in my TED Talk, I did it without any real passion, and now as an older individual, it just wasn't okay. I felt, that this is sort of my, my last chapter, so to speak, not to sound maudlin at all about it, but I was at the end of my career or near the end of my career. And this was the last chapter. And I didn't want to spend my last chapter doing something that I had no passion for. I had done plenty of that earlier in my career, working at something I had no passion for. But I wanted to sort of turn that around here in the final chapter. And as it turned out, a former colleague of mine had started his own business in Asia, actually, in an area that I found interesting. He was creating packaging out of waste material, packaging somewhat like the egg cartons that we all have in our refrigerator. It's called molded pulp or molded fiber, where you take the waste from paper or different agricultural fibers, and you mold them under pressure and heat, etc., and you create a package that way. And that's how the egg carton is manufactured. And it's a universal example of molded fiber packaging. It's just not a very sexy one. there's a lot more interesting packaging than egg cartons, but that's sort of the granddaddy of the category. Well, he was in that business, asked me if I wanted to be his North American sales manager. I was an engineer and never felt like I was a very good salesman. And that didn't really appeal to me. And I told him, I said, I appreciate the offer, but I just don't think I'd be a good salesman for you. I really don't. So we left it at that. But I thought about what he was doing, and I really liked what he was doing. And I asked him how he would feel if I started my own business here in the States. But rather than manufacturing that kind of packaging, what if I outsourced it to him and he did my manufacturing for me? Basically, he said, I don't see the big difference between that and you being my salesman in North America. He said, it sounds great to me. And I said, well, the difference is I'd have my own venture and you'd be, quote, only my manufacturer, not, I wouldn't be your employee. And of course, to him, economically, it sounded very much like the same thing he was offering. So we began our relationship that way, and that's how my business was born.
If any of those 4 segments inspired you, please go listen to the entire episode, as there is a lot more to each. Now, on to the next 100 episodes. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You will get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, new blog posts. I recently published my latest white paper, Ageism, the Last Acceptable Bias. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on Facebook and LinkedIn. You'll still find me on Twitter at Career Pivot, though I'm not using it anymore. At least I'm not tweeting anymore. Thank you for listening to all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-300. You can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. This podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.